Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to another of these evening talks. If you think I'm a little bit underclothed, simple explanation for that. My daughter's been in most of the day with the heating turned up high, so it's actually very warm in here tonight, just for a change. One of the things that I've been very aware of recently, of course, is my good fortune. Now, you may think, why would that be? I'm just very thankful that when we are denied doing so many of the things that we love to do, that I'm, like many of you, are so fortunate to be able to turn to something which is a certainty and a love that we can utilize and enjoy at any time. That, of course, is the love of music. And over the last few months, that joy and that love has just grown for myself, even though my entire life, my whole career, and way back to being a child, music has dominated everything that I've ever done. But even in spite of that, it's still managed to grow. And I'm very, very thankful for having that as part of my life. And I realize that not everybody has that. And as you know, I've never got out very much. So to have an opportunity to get to know new pieces of music and revisit old pieces that I know very well has been a real joy and a real comfort. And so it's in that spirit that I want to introduce a piece to you tonight, which I hope many of you will enjoy as much as I do. And it's not a particularly well-known piece, but I think it deserves to be. That piece is, would you believe, Johann Sebastian Bach cantata. A cantata is called Nach dir Herr verlanget mich, which basically means, Lord, I long for you. It's BWV 150. So cantata BWV 150. Nach dir Herr verlanget mich. And there are loads of unusual things about this piece, but in particular, I want to stress some of the most important. One of which is that we think this is the earliest cantata that Bach wrote that has survived. We don't have the original score. We only have a copy that was made by one of his pupils after he had died, or at least it was discovered after Bach's death. So we're not desperately sure about its origin, but the latest scholarship, as I've read, seems to suggest that it was written in 1707 when Bach was at Arnstadt. And if that's the case, then the composer was only 22 years old at the time, which by Bach standards is very young. So it's very much a young person's piece. And certainly the characteristics and the techniques involved in this piece all point to it being a young person's work. It's completely different from the kind of heavy-duty Bach that we normally are familiar with, the B minor Mass or the Passions and so on. I love those too, of course, but they're very, very different. And one of the things that really appeals to me about this cantata is that feeling of freshness and individuality and sheer youthful enthusiasm, even though it's actually on a very sad subject and a very topic. So that's the first thing. It's just a very early work. It's a young man's work, and it displays lots of characteristics that we associate perhaps with a younger composer. That in itself is exciting enough. Other things that are extraordinary about this piece, it involves the chorus for most of the time. I think 4 out of the 7 movements are choruses, which is very unusual in cantatas. It also has a very small ensemble. The accompaniment consists of 2 violins, bassoon, and continuo. That's it. So you couldn't wish for a smaller, more economic ensemble to perform this piece with. But that's not the end of it. What else is extraordinary about this piece is we associate the cantatas being very much connected with the whole history of the chorale, the kind of Lutheran hymn tune of its day. Most cantatas end, or sometimes begin as well, with a chorale or chorale variations or chorale theme in some respect or another. And they also tend to have recitatives, and they also tend to have da capo arias. Now, this cantata has none of those. It has no chorales. It has no reference to a chorale. It has no recitative at all. And it doesn't have any da capo arias. It does have, as I said, quite a lot for the chorus to do, but it also has the choruses interspersed with very short, very contrite solo passages, which are amazing and really no hanging about at all. There's no padding here. There's no going on at length. He comes in, makes a point, and then moves on. So that's quite unusual with this piece. But there's more. There's more, which is really interesting, I think, about this. The text, first of all, let me explain. This is a combination of extracts from Psalm 25 with some contemporary poetry that was written along the same kind of themes, the same kind of lines as the Psalm 25 itself. Now, this in itself is quite unusual. Towards the latter part of his career, Bach did utilize quite a lot of non-biblical texts, so the writings of contemporary writers, writing basically religious poetry, which Bach then set to music. But when you think about it, if you are a composer of liturgical or sacred music, you've got this wealth of material, the whole of the Bible, the whole of the prayer book, whatever you want to pick, masses of text, which are, as it were, on the shelf. And as a composer, all you have to do is reach down from one of these massive books and find a passage that interests you and set it to music. That would be the obvious thing to do, but not for Bach. He bases it on some verses from a psalm, which of course is sort of Old Testament rather than New Testament. But he then incorporates this poetry, which is just remarkable. And again, an example of the composer going the extra mile, making life more difficult for himself than he perhaps needed to. That's really interesting in itself. What is the subject? Well, the subject, as you can imagine, is all about mankind and our rather hard lives that we're leading. We're having to cope with storm, pestilence, hardship, plague, you name it, all those things. So it's quite apt for the moment, but in a rather depressing way. But of course, being a religious work and being Bach, there is hope at the end. And the piece ends with an affirmation of joy and hope for the future, that with, of course, God's help, all will be well in the end. So typical sort of subject of its time, and very, as I say, very apt for where we are today. But I don't think it's in a depressing way, because if anything, I find it quite reassuring that previous generations have gone through, in many ways, similar hardships, similar problems, similar challenges to the ones we're going through now. And I know they had their faith, which helped, but nevertheless, they got through, whether they had faith or not, they got through it and lived, most of them, remarkable lives and produced wonders, absolute wonders of art and literature and music, such as this piece. And that, in the end, I find really quite reassuring, that there is hope, because previous generations have suffered so much and yet got through it, got by, and survived in some way or other. So let's just get back to the actual music. As I said, this is so typically a young person's work, in particular because rather than having a very strict structure and very cerebral methods of writing the music, instead he allows himself to be incredibly flexible and fleet of foot. So 1 minute we're in one tempo and one key, and then suddenly we flip to something completely different, and then we flip back again, and then we go to another tempo and another atmosphere, all within a very short space of time. None of this sitting around for hours waiting for something to happen. It constantly changes. It's like a teenager with, although even though he's 22, it's that kind of mind, somebody who can't quite concentrate for long periods of time on one thing or one idea, but is constantly flitting, constantly looking for something else, another view, another way of looking at something. And this piece is full of those kind of ideas. But there are some really set things which is quite interesting to know before you listen to this piece. The opening is an opening sinfonia. It's all set in B minor. But as soon as the opening sinfonia finishes, in the same tempo, in the same key, the chorus come in with this very, very distinctive pattern. And it consists of an octave, a rising octave, followed by descending semitones. And once the one voice has had it, another voice comes in. So that scale, that rather distinctive octave leap followed by the descending chromatic scale, even has a name. It's called the Lacrimosa Lament, and it's often used not just by composers of Bach's generation, but previous generations, down back to as far as Monteverdi, used it a lot at moments to describe moments of pain or anguish or suffering, any of those kind of sad things. So it was already established as a musical device to express this kind of emotion that the composer was feeling. And it's absolutely apt and entirely appropriate for the mood of this piece. Here we are, people describing their pain, their suffering, all the rest of it, all the challenges of life. But almost as soon as that starts, that lament, we immediately he completely changes the mood. So something which is much lighter, much more buoyant, much more full of energy and lightness and an extraordinary amount of hope that's all expressed in the music by the most simplest of forms. Repeated chords and a sort of trill-like figure in the soprano part. It just lifts the mood. And this is all so quick. The whole cantata lasts about 14 minutes in all. And there are 7 movements. So it gives you an idea just how short each movement is and how quick the transitions are from one idea to another. And this is very unlike mature Bach, where everything takes a long time. Think of the Kyrie at the beginning of the B minor Mass. This massive piece just on one piece of text goes on for a massive amount of time. It's wonderful, it's glorious music, but it's the complete opposite of this, which is so lively and by the minute and constantly changing. Then this opening chorus is followed by a soprano solo, which in itself is quite remarkable. It's one of the most feisty bits of soprano writing I can think of anywhere in Bach's works. It's very, very short. It's very dynamic. She's basically saying, I know everything's hard, but right is right, and I'm absolutely certain that everything will be okay. So it's a kind of really throwing down the law to any colleagues wanting to listen that, you know, yes, we know everything's bad, but don't worry, everything will be okay. Right is right and will always be right. And then even after the next chorus, which I won't make too many comments about, other than to say it's full of clever little devices, such as a rising scale, which goes all the way up through the parts. Nothing particularly unusual about that, but in the context of the piece as a whole, it's really quite a novel idea. Again, it's this feeling of, here is all this doom and gloom and everything, you know, that we're having to struggle with, but there's always this kind of underlying progression, a rising scale, as opposed to the falling semitones, the lacrimosa idea that we had at the beginning. So the simplest of ideas, but very often, as we know in music, that sometimes the simplest ideas make the most sense. And that's followed, that chorus, by a trio. Now that again is quite unusual. There is only a handful of trios in the whole of Bach's output, in his cantata output. So to have an alto, tenor and bass trio is very unusual. And this particular trio has a text which makes reference to storms and winds and difficult weather. And needless to say, Bach, being the young composer, decides he's going to represent these rapid winds and storms using not the vocal parts, but the accompaniment, in this case, the bass part. And it is quite extraordinary just how he manages to do that with such small ensembles, such simple resources, such small resources. It's basically a cellist going absolutely bonkers, playing these semiquavers very, very rapidly, while the trio of voices declaim the text above that. And I'll play you an excerpt of that in a moment. And then just towards the end, we have two final choruses to this piece. Again, the first of which is unusual because it's in the context of this piece, the B minor piece. This is in D major, it's in the major key. And it's also in 6/8. And 6/8, as we know, is a time signature that we tend to associate with dance forms and dance music. So in the context of this piece, the doom, the gloom, the challenges, etc., here you have this extraordinary moment of almost surreal dance-like material, but in a very, very subtle way. It's not banal, it's not ridiculous, it makes perfect sense. And around the voices, he wants to create this kind of halo of sound using very few instruments. So what does he do? He gets the violins to imitate each other very, very closely, so that alternately. So you get this kind of effect at the top of the texture, and at the bottom of the texture, he puts the bass line and the bassoon very close together, again imitating each other. Bop, 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 bop. And the two together creates this kind of haze of wonderfully subtle material, wonderful subtle texture around which the voices sing really quite simple music. It's quite homophonic. It's not particularly academic music at all. It's really emotional. It's very reacting to the text, reacting to the mood. in an incredibly expressive way, which almost a romantic way, which we don't normally associate with Bach. We think of Bach as being very much the academic, the great craftsman. But this is, whilst it's beautifully crafted, it's also a music of the heart. It's music of the passion. It's expressing. It's full of ideas and constantly changing ideas and musical thoughts, really played out. And this is just one cantata out of the hundreds that he wrote altogether. And then just to crown it all off, at the end of the piece, we have the final chorus, which again, you would probably expect something quite learned. As I said at the beginning of this talk, normally you would get a chorale, but no chorale here. Instead, Bach writes a chaconne, and a chaconne is basically another dance. It's a Spanish dance originally, based on the idea of a recurring bass line. If you think of Pachelbel's canon, although it's called Pachelbel's canon, it is actually more like a Passacaglia or a chaconne. It's that constantly repeating bass line pattern that gives it its rather unique atmosphere. And this is possibly quite likely to be derived from Pachelbel, but it sounds like this. Very, very simple music, just a rising bass line in triple time. And it goes again. And the third time, and so on. But what's remarkable about this is this pattern, of course, is again an ascending phrase. We're still in B minor, but it's the complete opposite of the opening. The opening of the piece had that rising octave and then these falling semitones. And this is like an inversion of that idea. So instead, we start at the bottom of the scale and we work our way up. This is where the whole concept of the hope coming in, that we will get through this, that there will be joy again, and with God's help, we will survive. This is what Bach is expressing here in the simplest of ways. And one of the things that also is interesting about this, that phrase was borrowed by no lesser composer than Brahms. If you're familiar with Brahms's Fourth Symphony, the last movement of Brahms' Fourth Symphony uses exactly that bass line, or slightly adapted to be fair, but it's nevertheless derived from that bass line as the basis of his Passacaglia in the last movement of the Fourth Symphony. And you think, well, how can there be a connection? Well, very simply, there is a connection because Brahms was a member of a group of people who investigated the music of Bach when it was being published in the middle of the 19th century. And so Brahms almost certainly came across this piece as part of his work as an editor and an advisor to the publishers who were publishing the cantatas of Bach at that time. So he came across it, obviously was attracted in some way, and utilized it in his symphony, which followed a few years later. So extraordinary connection. And there's another point about this piece which I think is worth saying, that as I think I mentioned at the beginning, Bach almost certainly wrote this while he was at Arnstadt, and around about 1707 seems to be the right year, because he left Arnstadt soon after that. And when he went to his next job, which was at Mühlhauser, it's quite likely that he used this piece, this cantata, as, if you like, his calling card to demonstrate to his prospective new employers just the sort of thing that he was capable of writing. So it seems likely, therefore, if he was to use this piece to enable him to get a new job and to get a new post, Bach himself must have been quite pleased with it, and I'm not surprised. I think it's an absolutely glorious piece, and it's well worth spending 14 minutes of your time to have a listen to. Let me just play a couple of excerpts. This is quite close to the beginning. I'll get it up and running in a second. Just bear with me. My Bluetooth cut out. 21st century issue, always, when your Bluetooth doesn't stay connected, but we're there now. Okay. So this is quite near the beginning, and you'll hear the octave leaps and the chromatic path, the lacrimosa idea, with any luck. Here it is. So that chromatic descent. This passage finishes with the simple words, "My God!" And we have a complete change of mood. Great German consonants. We go back to the allegro. I'm just going to cut it off there and move on to the trio that I talked to you about. This is where the alto, tenor, and bass soloists are accompanied by just the continuo, but the cello in particular, and they have this extraordinary representation of a storm, of a pestilent wind. And if I can find the right place, it sounds like this. That's the end previous chorus. Then you hear
Oftmals achtet nicht, was wir bewegt. Sein Wort alles, was anderes
Amazing, absolutely amazing writing. So simple, but so effective. Just using the cello in that virtuoso manner. And the other movement I just wanted to play a little bit of an example is this famous chaconne at the end, the final movement. And one of the things that Bach did in the middle of this, and I hope this will show out, it'll come across, as well as writing this very sedate bass line, which repeats over and over again, and there's some beautiful vocal writing over the top. He then harks back to the origins of the chaconne, which was originally a Spanish dance, and he makes the violins imitate the strumming of guitars. So amongst all this kind of hope and joy that's promised at the end of this process, he introduces this extraordinary idea of making violins imitate a guitar, because we're writing a chaconne, and because the chaconne has an origin as a type of Spanish guitar dance. It's bizarre. It's absolutely bizarre. But it's so typical of not of Bach as we think of him, but Bach as he almost certainly was as a young man, full of ideas, full of extraordinary imagination. Anyway, let's see what you think of this.
This is
the end of the previous movement, the chaconne, the finale, as it were. My days of suffering are now over. Still got that recurring bass line. Joined in by the bassoon. It's brilliant, that's brilliant. The guitars are back. Nach der Herr verlanget mich. Bach's Cantata BWV 150. I cannot recommend it warmly enough. I think you will have 14 minutes of pure joy from it. Although it sounds a bit morbid and a bit sad, especially at the beginning, it is, because everything works out in the end, it's quite a nice piece to do at the moment. And I just think it's the most wonderful composition of a young man with such talent, with such an amazing outlook on musical composition and what can be done with the simplest of devices, just a few voices and a very few instruments, putting it together in this extraordinary way and producing something which I think is really quite remarkable. I hope you get a chance to catch up with it. There's a very good version done by Voces 8, which that recording was taken from, where you can actually see them performing as well, which is nice. That's on YouTube, but there's lots of other good versions. John Eric Garner's done it. The Netherlands Bach Society have got a very good recording. There's lots of really good recordings out there, but do have a listen, and I hope you enjoy it. Many thanks for listening. Many thanks, my loyal listeners, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now.